lastly, Sayadaw says the purpose of observing what is happening when there is pain. I don't say observing pain, yeah? The purpose of observing what is happening when there's pain is to understand the nature of pain, how pain is related to the mind, okay, and how our reaction is related to our perception, whatever. To understand the nature of the interaction of the mind and body when there's pain, and to and so to understand the nature of it. And the other thing is that we are not practicing to endure pain. Okay? We are not meditating to increase our tolerance to things. So often we hear other yogis, right? When yogis are in a good state of, like, their sati has much momentum, the samadhi, the mind is much more stable, and so on. Yogis report things like, Sayadaw, I was sitting and I was having pain and I was observing, and then the pain, sort of dissolved, and then I continued. And what other yogis hear is, oh, pain will go away if I watch it, right? And then Sayadaw says, but then these other yogis, they might be observing their pain and it's not going away, it's getting worse. And then what they say to themselves to make themselves feel better, oh, it's not going away now, but it will eventually go away. Like, that's the purpose of it, or like that's what is supposed to happen, And then they will feed themselves thoughts like, oh, everything is impermanent anyway, so that means pain must go away because everything is impermanent, so pain is also impermanent, right? He says, but the motivation is all wrong. The motivation is that not to learn, it's just to have it go away, but what's the point? So he says, the idea that we should be having of the purpose of meditation is that as I observe, what will I learn about the whole landscape of the experience when there is this object, right? The whole landscape. So there is pain, so what's the body feeling, what's the mind feeling, and particularly how is the mind observing, what sort of ideas does it hold. And that landscape is important, right? And what can you learn about it? It's not about getting rid of pain. He says, so our purpose is to observe things and learn, right? But the learning can only happen if whatever we observe, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, the mind observes it with a neutral attitude, right? If the mind is equanimous and observes, then it can learn because then it has no preset idea of what it's supposed to be, right? It doesn't have an idea of the destination. It's open, yes? But we're not always equanimous when we watch. Right? So the learning is not actually about the object. The learning is how do you become equanimous? And you learn to become equanimous by watching the reactions. Right? So you watch the reactions in the mind towards the object to learn what the mind is having a problem with. And when the mind understands the reaction of the mind, that's when the mind becomes equanimous. So Sayadaw says, when the mind is biased in its observation, we're never going to learn. Okay, so that's why it's more important to recognize the bias in the mind. And when those clear away because we recognize them and understand them, they're clear, then the mind becomes in the right mood, he says. So he says it's not about learning how to fix the object. Okay, it's not about learning how to get rid of pain, for example, right? It's not about learning how to do something with the object. It's about learning how to observe. Sayadaw always says, if we are experiencing an object, situation, event, whatever, and the mind is reacting to it, the mind doesn't like the situation or the mind likes the situation. At that time, Sayadaw says, what we are liking or disliking is not the right object for meditation because the mind is biased towards it, right? Then what you have to do is watch that bias. The mind likes or dislikes. Watch that bias. And until that bias is gone, you cannot go back to that object because you're still watching it in a biased way. So what is the middle way? Sayadaw says, outside of the middle way, there is aversion. We don't like the experience. And there is greed. We like the experience, right? And not the experience. The two extremes of the way we perceive our experiences, right? And we don't look at the experiences, we look at the greed and the aversion. Okay, we look at the greed and the aversion, and when there is wisdom about the greed and the aversion, the mind becomes equanimous. So the equanimity comes because of wisdom. It's not trying to be equanimous, yeah? It's not trying to watch in a neutral way. You watch the reaction that there is, and then when the mind understands it, the mind becomes equanimous. Then you're on the middle way. Sayadaw says there, just to, spike your interest. Sayadaw says, so there's, consider this, yeah? When the mind has a reaction to pain, the mind is resistant to pain, has aversion to pain, how does the mind feel about pain? So this is our usual experience, right? So the mind is uncomfortable, pain feels solid, it feels unbearable, it feels uncomfortable. Okay, this is we can investigate this, examine it in more detail. And then he says, as we examine how the perception is when there is all these reactions, you will get to a stage where there is less reaction, right? And then you will get to a place where sometimes it's not reacting. And then when it's not reacting, you check. Compared to when it was reacting, now it's not reacting, what is the mind's perception of pain? How does the mind now view pain when there's no reaction? Okay, so definitely you will see that there's a different view. Okay, you will have a different experience of pain when you have no reaction towards it, when you have no aversion towards it, no resistance. And finally, Sayadaw says, when we have a deeper understanding of the nature of pain, that's another level. Sayadaw says, when there's wisdom, then how does the mind experience pain? So 3 types of minds. One is aversion, one is without aversion, and one is without aversion but with wisdom as well. So he says, we have greed, right? When we have greed, we find things desirable. Yes? When we have aversion, we find things repulsive. We want to push them away, right? So when there is wisdom instead of greed and aversion, how do you think the mind will? What will the wise mind's response to objects be? It's something for us to find out, right? Yeah, then the observation has a purpose. Not to get anywhere, but to really observe so that some learning can happen. Not to try and squeeze the learning out, but just to be present, right? Yeah. He says, all our objects that we observe are changed, or rather the object is not so much changing, but our perception of the object is always changing based on the mood of the mind that is observed.